If the Bible was right about things no one believed could happen, then the terrifying question isn't whether it's true. The question is, what will you do if it's right about the rest? Because these aren't vague predictions written after the fact. These are city names, empire names, dates, real people with real names, and all of it already happened, documented, verified, undeniable. If you're tired of generic faith talk and want to see the Bible stand up to actual history, subscribe to join us on this journey. These videos aren't quick, but they dig deep. And if anything in this video makes you uncomfortable, leave a comment. Growth usually starts there. Let's start with a city that thought it was absolutely untouchable. Tyre was the New York of the ancient world, except richer and more arrogant. This wasn't just a city. It was a fortress split between the mainland and an island, controlling the entire Mediterranean trade network. Their wealth was obscene. They cornered the market on purple dye, the color of royalty, extracted from thousands of sea snails. They controlled cedar wood from Lebanon. They manufactured glass. Their navy was unmatched. Kings paid tribute to them. And their walls, these weren't ordinary walls. The mainland fortifications were considered some of the strongest in the world, and the island fortress half a mile offshore was thought to be completely unconquerable. They looked at attacking armies and laughed. Then, around 586 BC, the prophet Ezekiel stood up and said something that sounded absolutely insane. He said Tyre would be destroyed, not by one nation, but by many nations coming against it like waves of the sea. He said the walls would be broken down, the towers demolished, the stones, the timber, even the rubble would be thrown into the water. The city would be scraped so clean it would become a bare rock where fishermen spread their nets, and it would never be rebuilt. Imagine being in the crowd when Ezekiel said this. Tyre had stood for centuries. It had survived every siege. The idea that it would not just fall, but be scraped bare and thrown into the sea, must have sounded like the ravings of a madman. Here's where it gets interesting. When Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon showed up, he laid siege to mainland Tyre for 13 years. 13 years. His army surrounded the city, cut off supplies, built siege works. It was one of the longest sieges in ancient history. And when he finally broke through the walls, you know what he found? Almost nothing. The people of Tyre had moved everything of value to the island fortress. All the wealth, all the important people, everything gone. The mainland fell, but the island, protected by the sea and with a powerful navy, remained completely untouchable. Critics of the Bible pointed to this and said, "See? Ezekiel was wrong. The prophecy failed. Tyre still stands." Except it didn't fail. 240 years later, Alexander the Great arrived in 332 BC. Alexander had just defeated the Persian army and was marching down the coast. Tyre was a Persian ally, and Alexander demanded they surrender. The Tyrians, safe on their island, refused. They even killed Alexander's messengers. Big mistake. Alexander wanted that island, but he had a problem. He didn't have a navy strong enough to take it, and his army couldn't swim half a mile in full armor. So Alexander did something that had never been done before. He looked at the ruins of mainland Tyre, the rubble from Nebuchadnezzar's siege, and ordered his engineers to build a causeway, a land bridge from the shore straight to the island. For months, his army worked. They took every stone from the destroyed mainland city, every piece of timber, every bit of rubble. They threw it all into the sea, building a pathway. The Tyrians tried to stop them, sending fire ships, but Alexander's forces pressed on. And here's the eerie part. As they built, they scraped the mainland site so clean that it literally became bare rock. Multiple nations were involved, just as Ezekiel said. Babylon first, then Alexander's coalition of Greek, Macedonian, and other forces, waves of armies. When Alexander's forces finally reached the island, Tyre fell. The city that had laughed at attackers was destroyed. Today, 23 centuries later, that causeway is still there. It's a peninsula now, widened by sand deposits, and on the ancient mainland site, where Tyre once stood in glory, fishermen spread their nets on bare rock. Exactly as Ezekiel predicted. Everything that thinks it's untouchable eventually falls. The question is, does it fall before or after you're ready? Fast forward to around 30 AD. Jesus and his disciples are walking past the temple in Jerusalem, and the disciples are absolutely in awe. They're pointing out the massive stones, some weighing over 400 tons, the gold plating covering the building, catching the sunlight, the grandeur. This wasn't just a building. This was the center of Jewish faith, identity, and national pride. It was one of the architectural wonders of the ancient world. The historian Josephus would later write that from a distance, the temple looked like a mountain of snow and gold. It had been standing for centuries. It survived Babylonian conquest. It survived Persian rule. It survived Greek occupation. And now, under Roman control, it still stood as the one thing that couldn't be taken from the Jewish people. And Jesus says something that must have stopped them cold in their tracks. He says, "Do you see all these great buildings? Not one stone will be left on another. Every single one will be thrown down." That's not just predicting destruction. That's predicting total, complete annihilation. His disciples probably couldn't even process what he was saying. The temple was permanent. It was protected by God himself, wasn't it? Rome occupied the land, sure, but even Rome wouldn't dare destroy the temple. It would cause an uprising they couldn't control. It would unite every Jewish faction against them. It was unthinkable. But Jesus didn't say it might fall. He said it would fall. 40 years later, in 70 AD, the Romans laid siege to Jerusalem. The Jewish revolt had pushed Rome too far, and now Rome, under General Titus, was pushing back. The siege was brutal. Starvation, disease, desperation. The historian Josephus, who was there and witnessed everything firsthand, described what happened next. The temple caught fire. Whether Roman soldiers started it intentionally, or whether it was an accident in the chaos of battle, historians still debate. But what happened next isn't debated at all. The gold leaf that covered the temple melted in the intense heat, and as it melted, it flowed down between the massive stones of the temple walls. The Roman soldiers, wanting to collect every bit of that gold, literally pried apart every single stone to get to it. They dismantled the temple stone by stone, not one stone left on another. Exactly as Jesus said. 40 years earlier, Jesus didn't say the temple could fall. He said it would fall. And when it did, no one could hide in religion or rituals anymore. The physical center of their faith was gone. Around 700 BC, 7 full centuries before Jesus was born, the prophet Isaiah wrote something in chapter 53 that still makes scholars deeply uncomfortable. He described a figure he called the suffering servant, and the details are disturbingly, unnervingly specific. He would be despised and rejected by his own people. He would have no beauty or majesty that would attract people to him. He would be pierced for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace would be on him. He would be oppressed and afflicted, yet he wouldn't open his mouth in his own defense, like a lamb led to slaughter, silent before its shearers. He would be assigned a grave with the wicked, criminals, but would be buried with the rich in his death. And somehow, through all this suffering, through his death, many would be justified, made right. For centuries, Jewish scholars debated who Isaiah was talking about. Some said it was Israel as a nation, suffering under exile. Others said it was a future king, a military deliverer. Some said it was Isaiah himself, but no interpretation made all the details fit. Then Jesus of Nazareth appeared. He was rejected by the religious leaders of his own people, the ones who should have recognized him. He had no political power, no military force, nothing that people expected from a Messiah. He was arrested, put on trial, mocked and beaten. At his trial before Pilate, when accused, he remained silent, not defending himself, exactly as Isaiah wrote. He was crucified, the Roman execution method that literally involved piercing through the hands and feet. He hung between two criminals, assigned to die with the wicked. But after his death, Joseph of Arimathea, a rich member of the Sanhedrin, asked for Jesus' body and buried him in his own new tomb. Buried with the rich. Every single detail. 700 years written in advance. But here's what makes Isaiah 53 different from every other prophecy we'll look at. It doesn't just predict events. It tells us why. It says he was pierced for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. It wasn't for his own sins, because he had committed no violence and there was no deceit in his mouth. It was for ours. The punishment that brought us peace was on him. By his wounds we are healed. Isaiah 53 doesn't just predict what would happen. It predicts the entire purpose behind everything Jesus came to do. And by the way, we know Isaiah wrote this before Jesus because we have the Dead Sea Scrolls, manuscripts dated to at least 100 BC, containing the complete book of Isaiah. This wasn't written after the fact. This was written centuries before. Around the same time, 700 BC, the prophet Micah made a prediction that seemed almost like a throwaway detail. He said the Messiah, the ruler who would shepherd Israel, would be born in Bethlehem Ephrathah. Not just any Bethlehem, because there were two towns with that name in ancient Israel. Bethlehem Ephrathah, the small one, the insignificant one near Jerusalem. The one so unimportant that Micah himself notes it was small among the clans of Judah. Why would the promised king, the heir to David's throne, the hope of Israel, be born in a nowhere town? It made no sense. Jump ahead 7 centuries. Joseph and Mary are living in Nazareth, about 90 miles north of Bethlehem. Mary is pregnant, and according to their belief, she's carrying the promised Messiah. Except there's a problem. They're in completely the wrong town. The prophecy says Bethlehem. They're in Nazareth. Then something unexpected happens. Caesar Augustus, the Roman emperor sitting in Rome, who had absolutely no idea he was fulfilling ancient Jewish prophecy and couldn't have cared less about it, issued a decree. A census for taxation purposes. Everyone in the empire had to return to their ancestral hometown to register. Joseph was from the line of David, and David's family was from Bethlehem. So Joseph, with Mary who was about to give birth, traveled 90 miles south, and Jesus was born exactly where Micah said he would be, in Bethlehem Ephrathah. Here's what makes this absolutely fascinating. Even the enemies of Jesus knew this prophecy. When Herod heard about a newborn king from the Magi, he was threatened. He called together the chief priests and scribes and asked them directly, "Where is the Messiah supposed to be born?" They didn't hesitate. They quoted Micah immediately. Bethlehem. They knew the prophecy. They just didn't believe Jesus was the fulfillment. God doesn't miss details. He orchestrated a Roman census to move 2 people 90 miles so a baby could be born in the right town. And if he didn't miss a small town that barely mattered on any map, he doesn't miss your life either. Now, let's talk about Babylon. Babylon wasn't just a city. It was the empire, the superpower, the gold standard of power and glory. The walls were so thick that chariots could race on top of them. Ancient historians said they were over 300 feet high and 80 feet thick. The Hanging Gardens were considered one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Their military had crushed nation after nation. They had destroyed Jerusalem, carried away the people of Judah into exile. Babylon was unstoppable, eternal, magnificent. Then the prophets Isaiah and Jeremiah both said something that sounded absolutely ridiculous. They said Babylon wouldn't just fall like other empires, it would be completely destroyed, uninhabited, so desolate that nomads wouldn't even pitch their tents there. It would become a haunt for desert creatures and owls. It would never be rebuilt or inhabited again. Never. That's a big word. When Cyrus the Persian conquered Babylon in 539 BC, he didn't destroy it. He walked in virtually unopposed, preserved the city, made it part of his empire. Critics of the Bible pointed to this and said, "Look, the prophecy failed. Babylon didn't fall the way Isaiah and Jeremiah said it would. But the prophecy didn't say Babylon would fall immediately and dramatically. It said it would become desolate and never be rebuilt." And over the following centuries, exactly that happened. The city was gradually abandoned. The Euphrates River changed course. The buildings crumbled. Sand buried the ruins. By the time of Christ, Babylon was already a ghost town. By the Middle Ages, its location was forgotten. Fast forward to the 1980s. Saddam Hussein decided he would rebuild Babylon and restore it to its ancient glory. He poured enormous resources into the project. He even had bricks made with his name stamped on them, imitating Nebuchadnezzar. He saw himself as the new Babylonian king. The project failed. Completely. Wars came. Saddam fell. And today, more than 2,500 years after Isaiah and Jeremiah prophesied, Babylon is exactly what they said. Desolate ruins that no one inhabits. Nomads still won't camp there. The local Iraqis consider it cursed. History has proven that no empire is too big to fall, and no pride is too strong for God to ignore. Around 593 BC, the prophet Ezekiel, exiled in Babylon, had a vision that must have seemed like absolute madness to him. God took him to a valley, and the valley was full of bones. Human bones, scattered everywhere, dry, lifeless, bleached white by the sun. The picture of total death with no hope of recovery. Then God asked him a question. "Son of man, can these bones live? What do you say to that?" Ezekiel basically said, "Only you know, Lord." Then God told him to prophesy to the bones. So Ezekiel, probably feeling ridiculous, spoke to dead bones, and they started coming together. Bone connected to bone. Tendons appeared. Flesh covered them. Skin formed. But they were still dead. Then God told Ezekiel to prophesy to the breath, and breath entered them. They stood up as a vast army, alive again. And God explained what it meant. These bones are the whole house of Israel. They seem dead, scattered, cut off, with no hope. But God would bring them back to their land. He would put His Spirit in them. They would live. After the Romans destroyed Jerusalem in 70 AD, the Jewish people were scattered across the entire known world. For almost 2,000 years, they had no homeland. They lived in Europe, Asia, Africa, the Middle East, eventually the Americas. Empires rose and fell around them. The land they once occupied was controlled by Romans, Byzantines, Muslims, Crusaders, Ottomans, British. Every other ancient people group that lost their land disappeared into history. The Moabites, the Edomites, the Philistines, where are they? Gone. Absorbed. History suggested the same would happen to the Jews. Dead bones in a valley, scattered and dry. Then, on May 14, 1948, David Ben-Gurion stood in Tel Aviv and read the Declaration of Independence. Israel was a nation again. For the first time in 1900 years, the Jewish people had a homeland. They came from every corner of the earth. Holocaust survivors from Europe, ancient communities from Yemen and Ethiopia, refugees from Arab countries, different languages, different cultures, but the same identity. Bones coming together. Ezekiel saw this in a vision 2,500 years ago. We watched it happen on the evening news. It's not a metaphor. It's not symbolic. It's life returning from what was completely, totally dead. Around 600 BC, Daniel was a young Jewish captive in Babylon when King Nebuchadnezzar had a dream that terrified him. He saw an enormous statue. The head was made of pure gold. The chest and arms were silver. The belly and thighs were bronze. The legs were iron. The feet were partly iron and partly clay. Then a rock, cut out but not by human hands, struck the statue's feet. The whole thing collapsed into dust and blew away, while the rock became a mountain filling the whole earth. Daniel, given the interpretation by God, explained what it meant. The head of gold was Babylon itself. After Babylon would come another kingdom, inferior but still powerful, represented by silver. Then a third kingdom of bronze would rule. Then would come a fourth kingdom, strong as iron, crushing everything. But it would be divided, iron mixed with clay, trying to unite but never truly holding together. And finally, God himself would set up a kingdom that would never be destroyed. History unfolded exactly in that order. After Babylon came the Medo-Persian Empire, conquering Babylon in 539 BC. After Persia came Greece under Alexander the Great, sweeping across the known world with bronze weapons and armor. After Greece came Rome, the Iron Empire that crushed everything in its path, but eventually split and never reunited despite constant attempts. Daniel also saw these empires in another vision, as terrifying beasts rising from the sea, each one more dreadful than the last. But then he saw something different. He saw one like a son of man coming with the clouds of heaven, approaching the Ancient of Days and being given authority, glory, and an eternal kingdom that all peoples and nations would worship. Every kingdom Daniel mentioned rose and fell exactly in sequence, and every empire since Rome has tried to unite the world and failed. Charlemagne tried, Napoleon tried, Hitler tried, the Soviet Union tried. Modern attempts at global unity constantly fragment. Every human kingdom comes and eventually goes. Only one kingdom never falls. And the question that should keep you up at night is this: which kingdom do you belong to? Around 500 BC, the prophet Zechariah wrote something oddly, almost bizarrely specific. He described a shepherd who would be valued by his people, and his price would be 30 pieces of silver. And that silver would be thrown to the potter in the house of the Lord. 30 pieces of silver was the price of a slave according to Jewish law. It was an insult, a statement that someone's life was worth no more than property. Fast forward 500 years. Judas Iscariot, one of Jesus' own disciples, went to the chief priests and asked what they would give him to betray Jesus. They weighed out 30 pieces of silver. After Jesus was arrested, put on trial, and condemned to death, Judas was overwhelmed with guilt. He tried to return the money to the chief priests, saying he had betrayed innocent blood. They didn't care. So Judas threw the silver pieces into the temple and went out and hanged himself. The chief priests picked up the scattered coins and discussed what to do with them. They decided they couldn't put the money into the temple treasury because it was blood money, so they used it to buy the potter's field as a burial place for foreigners. 30 pieces of silver, thrown into the temple, used to pay the potter. Every detail from Zechariah, written 500 years before Judas was born. God doesn't just control the big events that change history. He controls the details that humans think are random, the choices people think are their own. We've just walked through 8 prophecies that were fulfilled, not in dreams, not in vague metaphors that could mean anything. In actual, documented, verifiable history. Cities destroyed exactly as predicted, down to the detail of stones being thrown into water. Empires rising and falling in precise order. A Messiah born in a specific town, dying in a specific way, buried in a specific manner, for a specific purpose. A nation scattered for 2,000 years coming back from the dead. Details so specific that even the number of coins and where they ended up was predicted centuries in advance. And this leads to a question you cannot avoid. If God was right about the past, then he might be right about the future. The Bible doesn't just contain prophecies that have already been fulfilled. It contains prophecies about things that haven't happened yet, about Jesus returning, about judgment, about eternity, about you making a choice that matters forever. And if the prophecies we've examined came true with this level of precision, with this level of specific detail, then the question isn't whether the Bible is true. The question is, what will you do with that truth? Because here's what makes this different from every other religious text or philosophical system. These prophecies are falsifiable. They name real cities that can be excavated, real empires that left records, real people whose lives were documented by hostile witnesses, and they all came true. That should terrify you or comfort you, but it shouldn't leave you neutral. If this video made you think, hit like so more people can wrestle with this question. Subscribe if you want to keep digging deeper into evidence that demands a response. And comment with this: which part of this video did you find hardest to ignore?